Here is a look at the skull. And notice we get a good look at the skull along with some important head and facial muscles. And I realize we're doing the brain here, brain and spinal cord, but we'll get to that. Just giving you a look. Here's the occipital skull plate and then the parietal skull plates. Really good look at the vertebral column with the spinal cord. Notice the yellow. The yellow are nerves. We have cranial nerves, which are part of the peripheral nervous system, and we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which are part of the peripheral nervous system. So, let's get rid of the skull there. And there's a pretty good look at how the brain is situated in the cavity, cranial cavity there. We'll peel off a few more layers. Let's get rid of the muscles. And let's get an idea. Great look at cerebral cortex, frontal region, prefrontal region, temporal, parietal, occipital, and then notice all the nerves. These nerves are all part of the peripheral nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord, central nervous system, and then the peripheral nervous system, cranial nerves, spinal nerves. Rotate this around. Good look at the spinal cord. Trace the spinal cord up here. And then you'll run into the medulla oblongata. Then the pons. And then the midbrain. Here's a great look at the cerebellum. Great look. Great look at the spinal nerves. Again, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Moving to effector organs. What are effector organs? Skeletal muscle, for example. But it could be glands as well. So that is excellent look at the posterior region of the CNS. Hello everybody, this is Mr. Walters, and this is Human Anatomy and Physiology. And I want to spend the majority of the next 15 minutes or so on the central nervous system. So looking at the different parts of the brain, the different regions of the brain, and the specific functions that are related to each of those regions. But before we do that, here's a model of a nerve cell. So notice here, this is the soma, or the cell body of the nerve cell. Notice all the synaptic junctions, which we spend a whole lot of time talking about here. So there's a really good look at a synapse. It has those synaptic vesicles, which contain the neurotransmitters, of which we've talked about extensively. It looks like we've got plenty of dendrites, and then of course there we have the axon. Over on the other side we have an axon, and notice that axon is myelinated here with a Schwann cell. Schwann cells of the peripheral nervous system will have a neurolemma, and those neurolemma aid in regeneration of damaged axons. So a damaged axon can follow the tunnel or the pathway of the neurolemma and make its way back, grow back, so to speak, to the appropriate, let's say, skeletal muscle innervation. So great look here. Here's the axon. Lots of mitochondria making cellular energy, ATP. Of course, a lot of that ATP is dedicated to the sodium potassium pump. So, pretty good look there. Now we're going to be talking about the central nervous system, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about structure and function of the brain. The brain is subdivided into several regions. What you're looking at there is the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. So that is the outer region of the cell. The vast majority of cell bodies of the central nervous system are going to be located here. Other regions of the brain include the diencephalon, which you cannot see. It's a deeper structure now. We'll also talk about the brainstem, and we'll also talk about the cerebellum. These, of course, can't be seen from this view. Let's talk the cerebrum first. So that's what we're looking at here. And this region here is going to be anterior. This region here is posterior. Then, of course, we're lateral and we're lateral. Notice all the grooves that are present. These grooves here are called sulcus or sulci plural. So notice these grooves. Lots of grooves. If it's a shallow groove, like we have here, it's a sulcus. If it's a large groove, we have a fissure. So here is the central fissure, which is going to separate the right side from, which will be it divides the brain into a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. So we have sulcus, and then we have fissures. What else? Look at these convolutions. These convolutions of tissue. These convolutions of tissue are called gyrus, singular, gyri. So we have many gyri present. Those folds are important because those folds are important because they will increase the surface area of the nerve tissue. It's important that we pack a lot of nervous tissue into a small amount of space. So, you know that if you want to organize things well, maybe newspapers, that sort of thing. You don't want them just lying all around, so you want to fold them. Get them organized, and you can fit a lot of newspaper or tissue into a small amount of space if you fold them efficiently. More surface area means more biochemistry going on in the brain, and we need the biochemistry for complex thought processes, which, by the way, is the role here of the cerebrum. Well, let's talk about the different lobes of the cerebral cortex. We have the frontal lobe, which incorporates this whole area. So this is the frontal lobe. We've got the right hemisphere. Remember, it's the subject's right side. So right hemisphere, left hemisphere. So these regions here, this would be the prefrontal cortex. So prefrontal cortex. Here we have on the left hemisphere, left prefrontal. This region of the brain would be important for higher thought processes. What specific are we talking about here on the left side? This side would be rational, logical, analytical, language. So rational, logical, analytical thought, language. Right here is the motor speech region. So this is motor speech in this region here. Now let's go over to the other side. So here we have the right prefrontal cortex. Again, higher thought processes, but more specifically, this is creativity, intuition, emotional, intuitive, artistic. So we have the right side of the brain, important for artistic, emotional, intuition, creative. We have the left side here, which is more analytical, rational. Maybe think of the left side here as your science math mind with language as well. And then over here on the right side, think of that as your creative art side, emotional side. Well, we also have the parietal region here. So this is parietal. This is the parietal. If you recall, the frontal is going to mimic, the name is going to mimic the skull plate. So we have the frontal skull plate, and we also have the parietal, we have the temporal, and we have occipital. So here is the parietal. Notice parietal on this side. Here in red, reading, sensory speech here. So sensory speech here, turquoise color. Reading, again, motor speech here. And by the way, this is a different region of the brain. So again, this is going to be the frontal region of the brain. Now notice here, parietal region, this is sensory cortex here, right here, sensory cortex. Now here at the posterior region of the frontal, this is motor cortex. So motor cortex, hip, trunk, shoulders, arms, wrist, through here, fingers, hands. So again, sensory and motor. Motor is sending nerve impulses away from the brain and spinal cord out to the periphery. Could be a gland, could be a muscle. Sensory here is receiving information through the sense organs and the peripheral nervous system, and then relaying that information to the spinal cord, and then up to the brain, and then maybe to this region of the brain. Notice on the opposite side, we have motor cortex here, motor cortex, and here we have the sensory region here. And again, we're on the right side of the body here. What are some of the sensory regions? Here they are again, hip, trunk, head, hand, fingers, thumbs, nose, face, etc. down in here. Of course, we have the central fissure here, which is going to separate the different hemispheres of the brain. Excuse that. The different hemispheres of the brain. So we have left hemisphere, right hemisphere. There is a connection so that the left side of the brain can communicate with the right side of the brain, and that's the corpus callosum. So corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres. We can't see that now because we're going to need a different cut. We're going to need a mid-sagittal cut through here, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Well, we have the temporal region here. This would be hearing input and interpretation. So temporal region here. hearing input and interpretation. We have the occipital region and back, so that's the occipital region. Let's take another view here. So notice this is the occipital region, and in yellow here we have visual interpretation, and here we have visual input. So visual input and visual interpretation. The visual input is going to receive information from the optic nerve, of which most of you have seen the dissection. And if you haven't seen the dissection yet, I haven't posted it, so there's a reason you haven't done that. But I will do that. And but you have seen various representations of the eye. And again, the optic nerve is going to carry nerve impulses back to this region here. Then, of course, information is going to be set to the interpretation region. Of course, we are defining these as various regions, but one region is not an island unto itself. No islands here. Information here is passed here. Then information is spread throughout, and the brain will make appropriate assimilations and responses if needed for that visual input. Notice here, this is a different region of the brain. So this is cerebral cortex, cerebrum here. Here we have the cerebellum. So notice it is posterior. So here's the cerebellum. Okay. Really good look there at the cerebellum. We'll talk about the role of the cerebellum in more detail at a different time. So again, this is a cerebral cortex. I want you to be familiar with the regions and be familiar with the various functions or roles of each of these regions of the brain. Also, make sure you know left brain, right brain. I'm talking prefrontal cortex, which is the artistic, intuitive, emotional side of the brain, and which is the analytical, mathematical, reasoning, rational side of the brain. So here's a lateral view of the model that we've just been talking about. And of course, here's the cerebellum. Sounds like cerebrum, but it's not, so cerebellum. And of course, we got the cerebral cortex. Again, we have frontal, we have parietal, we have the temporal region here. So temporal region. We have occipital region here. And if you go deep into here, there's another region of the cerebral cortex called the insula layer. So the insula layer, but it's a deeper structure. Again, here's sensory speech. Here's reading, hearing interpretation. We have the sensory cortex. This is receiving information from the outside world. Ultimately, it's coming from the outside world. Could be the tactile senses. Here is the motor region. Again, motor region, fingers, for example. So nerve impulses originating here will travel down through the brainstem, through the spinal cord, then out through one of the spinal nerves, and through the peripheral nervous system, and then maybe to the muscles, stimulating fine muscle motor control there. Fine motor control, I should say. Again, notice we've got motor speech here, which you couldn't see very well. So again, we got this boxing glove sort of appearance. And that's all cerebral cortex. Now notice here, this is a mid-sagittal view. So if we were to cut from the central fissure all the way down, we would have this view. Notice now we can see the corpus callosum. There's the corpus callosum, and that is going to send nerve impulses from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere of the brain and vice versa. Here's a good look at the cerebellum. Notice cerebral cortex here. Notice the sulci, notice the gyri. So sulci are the impressions here. Gyrus are the tissues. Of course, notice we have the skull here. And we also have, which we're not going to talk about right now, but I'll just mention it. We also have the meninges. So these are folds of tissue which surround and protect the brain and the spinal cord. Again, we'll get to that in a little bit. Let's just look at general regions. And it's also kind of interesting just to get an overall plan. Notice here we have the vertebrae. So these are cervical vertebrae. So you have the atlas, the axis, and the 7 cervical vertebrae. Notice how well protected, this is the spinal cord. So notice how well protected the spinal cord is from these vertebrae. It's a really good look there. Notice we have the nasal cavities here, sinuses here within the bones, so the nasal cavities here. Notice mouth, tongue, oral cavity back here, the pharynx. And then notice if we follow this path, that's leading to the stomach, so there's right there is the esophagus. And then notice this path is going to lead to the respiratory system. So we have the larynx, which is the voice box, and we also have the trachea, which is the windpipe. Pretty good look. Of course, we have integumentary system, we have muscular system here. This would be one of the major back muscles, maybe the trapezoid muscle, for example. But what else do we have? What else do we have in terms of CNS, Central Nervous System? Well, cerebrum, cerebellum. If we go to this region here, this is the diencephalon. So this is the diencephalon. It consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and other regions as well. But thalamus, hypothalamus are components of the diencephalon. Interesting little side note here, right here. That's the pituitary gland. So notice how well protected the pituitary gland is. Ensconced in this region of the skeletal system. That would be the sphenoid bone, which is that butterfly-shaped bone that we've talked about. And that depression is called the sella turcica. The sella turcica, that's the depression in which the pituitary gland. So, of course, the pituitary gland is what I've referred to in the past as the master gland of the body. It's responsible for a wide variety of hormonal type release and responses, which do any number of important things. Growth hormone, for example, is produced and secreted by the pituitary gland, a region of the pituitary gland. What else do we have here? The brain stem. is this region, so the brain stem. And the brain stem has several important regions of which we'll talk about the function. So the brain stem. What are the regions of the brain stem? Brain stem is going to extend through this region right here. Of course, here's the spinal cord. So the brainstem regions include the midbrain, this region here, the pons, right here, and this region here, the medulla oblongata. All have an important role. Right now we're talking anatomy. We will talk specific functions of these regions of the brain. The regions, for example, the diencephalon, we'll talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus, as well as the limbic system and a few other regions possibly in that general area. We'll talk about the brainstem with the midbrain, the pons, and the famous medulla oblongata. Again, this is more anatomy right now, and the physiology is to come. So, pretty good look here.